Welcome back to the Placeholder Podcast, everybody. I'm Caley Fretz, joined by an illustrious crew today. Abby, Mickey, welcome back to the show. Abby, good to have you back. Dane Cash, feeling pretty serious?
No, Caley, I'm not feeling pretty serious. I'm now feeling like I've just told people how a race was won. Maybe a few of them over the weekend. So go check out that podcast, folks.
Yeah, the Escape Collective Podcast Network. Well, I wouldn't say grows. Regrows to where it was.
I think rebrands is probably the actual word, but that's kind of a gross word. Yeah. The bike racing season is back, so we're back. Kit Nicholson, welcome back to the show.
It's good to be back.
How's your dog?
I think he's asleep. I can only see the whites of his eyes right now. Looking up at me, though, oddly. But he's fine. He's very warm.
That's good. I'm glad to hear it. Let's get into today's show. Obviously, no Johnny today, so Johnny's shorts will have to wait until next week. But we do have quite a lot to talk about because it was Omloop opening weekend last weekend. Lots of fantastic racing. Let's start with just a hearty congratulations to Jan Tratnik and Marianne Vos. I guess two opposite ends of sort of the Peloton spectrum in some ways. You've got the greatest of all time, and no offense to Jan Tratnik, but not the greatest of all time. Probably not even the greatest Slovenian at the moment. Definitely not the greatest Slovenian at the moment. But an incredible, incredible win, and called, as Dane said in this week's How the Races Won podcast, called by one of our members, Klaus. Good job, Klaus. Let's start with the women's race, though. Vos played that one to absolute perfection. We're not going to go into the sort of nitty-gritty of the tactics here. We have other podcasts for that. That's what we have Wheel Talk and How the Races Won for. But we got to talk about the GOAT. We got to talk about one of the greatest riders of all time, basically playing off one very strong team and one very strong rider.
Yeah, it was an awesome race for Vos. And I think for her coming into the season, she had iliac artery endofibrosis on her left leg. At the end of last season, she had surgery on that in August, and then she took the whole winter to recover from that and come back, and didn't race any cyclocross, didn't defend her cyclocross world championship at the beginning of this year, and instead focused on the road. And she's never raced Omloop Het Nieuwsblad before, but she raced it for the first time because she skipped the cyclocross season, her debut Omloop Het Nieuwsblad, and she took the win. And I think a lot of that was just because she was the strongest on the day. I mean, on the Mer van Gereldsbergen, the Kapelmer, I don't know, the climb with the church on top. After Cash and Iwadoma did a bit of a acceleration, Kopecky threw down and tried to really crack the rest of the peloton, or the riders that remained at the front. And Vos she didn't miss a beat. She had no problem sticking to Kopecky's wheel, and she really played it super smart in the finale, watching Kopecky chase down each of the Lidl Trek riders as they tried to throw the 1-2 punches at the two other riders. It was clear that Kopecky was doing a bit more work, but I think at the end of the day, Vos was just stronger on the day. And it was awesome to see because I went into it in detail in the Wheel Talk newsletter on Tuesday. Vos is the GOAT because she's been doing this for so long. It's been 20 years of Vos, and she's still on top. And it's just incredible to see her come back after the season she had last year with iliac artery endofibrosis, and to have surgery and come back and win Omloop is wild if you think about how much the women's peloton is changing over the last couple of years, that she continues to be on top. And so it's really exciting for fans of women's cycling, for fans of Vos, which I don't know how you couldn't be. It was just a great race.
I like the clip of her dad sitting in the hot seat and getting all excited at the end. That was so great. It was really great. Yeah. It's wild to me that she's never raced Omloop before, but I guess it's just because she's always racing cross up until 2 weeks ago.
She usually waits until around Flanders to come back. She'll come back and ease into it with something like Trofeo Alfredo Binda. And she raced Setmana Ciclista Valenciana a couple weeks ago now, and she was able to get second, I believe, on 2 stages. So she looked pretty good in Valenciana, but she couldn't beat Balsamo in a sprint. But I mean, it was the build up to what she was able to accomplish at Omloop Het Nieuwsblad, for sure.
I want to talk about Visma Lease a Bike more broadly because they won 3 out of 4 races this weekend, right? Because Wout van Aert won Kuurne Brussels Kuurne, Jan Tratnik won Omloop Het Nieuwsblad, Vos won Omloop Het Nieuwsblad, and then the only one left was Hageland. They did this last year on the men's side. then they failed to win the big ones. So that's the big question I think that we open this podcast with is we've seen dominant Visma Lisa bike once again. I don't think anyone was particularly surprised by that. We were joking about it in last week's episode that, how many of them would finish in the top 5, right? And I think we were pretty close in our estimates on that one. Then the big question is, can they pull off the big one? Dane, what do you think?
I do think that's specifically more of the men's side question, because on the women's side, it's this sort of weird dynamic where, yes, they have Mariana Voss, they have if this is basketball, it's like they've got Michael Jordan, but they're not the Bulls, right? Like on the women's side, if they can win really any of these, World Tour 1 days, that's a success for them, because SD Works is the big dog, the Chicago Bulls situation. On the men's side, though, it's very different. They are the dominant team, and so they need to do something in a San Remo, Flanders, Roubaix, if not 2 or 3 of them, because last year they were so dominant in races like the Omloop, which they won last year. And at the end of the Classics campaign, it felt like it was sort of a deflating experience, because they didn't actually win any of the monuments, which I think it's not golf. It's not tennis. Like, I think monuments in quotes have gained some cachet somehow over the last decade or two. Like, people care about them even more as if like other races don't matter. And we should give them credit for winning the Omloop. We should give them credit for winning Kurna, but like it or not, they are going to come away, I think, very disappointed if they don't win one of these 3. And Van Aert is actually racing only Flanders and Roubaix, so it's actually on the Christophe Laportes of this team to do this in San Remo.
I thought he's back for E3. Am I wrong about that?
No, that's right. Van Aert is going to be back for E3, so he's not at San Remo, he's not at Strade. Right. So he is focused clearly on the cobbled classics a little bit later, which means that's one fewer race with Wout van Aert as a potential contender. And that's the only one he's actually won in the past, which is San Remo. Flanders and Roubaix, he's focusing more squarely on this year.
Yeah, and he's trying something new. He's headed to altitude right now, right? And that's the reason why he's not going to be racing Strade and MSR and things like that. It's a new thing for him, and anytime I think you switch something up like that, it's a bit of a risk, although I would imagine Wout van Aert's done enough altitude training to know how he reacts to it. But still, it's a change-up. Obviously, they felt like a change-up was necessary after last year to try to get one of those big ones. So I think the big question mark is whether it will work.
Over the weekend, we saw how this team as a dominant force can work, and the way that their team depth can set them up to win big races. And I think Van Aert, it's like with Mathieu van der Poel, and this was true of Tadej Pogacar as well last year. They have fine teams around them. They're not the only riders on the team, obviously. But I think the onus is a little bit more on them than it is on Van Aert to be the only guy. And I think that's going to help. Again, it didn't get them over the line last year, but it'll certainly help having Jan Tratnik, who, as I said on the How the Races Won podcast, like, I didn't even mention Jan Tratnik in my Classics primer that I wrote last week. And he's on amazing form coming into this, but you have to choose. You have to say, like, all right, well, I can't name every rider on this team. Apparently you do, though. And that's how good they are. And I think that's we have to keep that in mind, that's going to help Van Aert coming off of altitude come Flanders and Roubaix time. He's got this powerful team around him.
You know who else looked good on the weekend? Toms.
Oh, yeah.
He really did.
We should talk about that. We have some insider knowledge, I would imagine, but also some deep conflict of interest in terms of objective analysis.
Yeah, I mean, it's great just to see, like, on Saturday when Toms was in a group with 3 Visma riders, Tom Pidcock, who seemed to be struggling on the hills but did perfectly well in the sprint at the end, and then Arnaud Delis, was it? But yeah, Tom seemed to be the only one who willing to repeatedly put them under pressure and actually make a pretty damn good job of it. Seems to be putting Van Aert to the sword, but then of course you have the Visma lot who, in that setting, it's almost pretty democratic. So one rider goes off the front, which eventually was Jorgensen. And then I think by that point, Delis and Pidcock had realised that they didn't want to take Squeenge with them either. They didn't want to take Toms with them. So they weren't going to work with him. So that was great to see. It's just a shame that they were all brought back. Always nice to see that.
I always really, really try to make an effort, and this has been true ever since I've gotten in this business, to say people's last names instead of their first names, because I don't want to create this chummy environment where we're like, oh, yeah, I was watching so and so, and when you say their first name, it makes it sound like we're friends with them. I've told Abby a couple of times, hey, we're not their friends, but it is weird calling him Squeech. Like that is...
Yeah, that didn't feel right.
In this particular instance, that feels weird. But I liked it too. I want Abby to not call him Tom's because that's just kind of funny. I wanted to make her uncomfortable, which is funny. But I said on the podcast this weekend, and I kind of want Abby to maybe weigh in here. As far as I can remember, I mean, this was the strongest showing we've seen in this kind of race from him so far. Is that accurate? Have there been times at races of this level on the cobbles where we've seen him like up there with the likes of Wout?
No, I think it was an interesting combination of the team goals not panning out exactly how they had maybe hoped when they went into the race, and him being in the right place at the right time, because over the years he's just been continuing to improve year on year, and I think that things kind of fell into place. But I also feel like, going into this year, a lot of guys on Little Trek are feeling pressure, but also motivation from the massive turnover of riders in the team, and the new talent that's come onto the team is making the team feel like the same environment in some ways because it's the same management and they have the same ethos, but it's a completely different environment in that you've got guys that are now like, a lot higher caliber than who they've maybe had on the team in the past. So I think that he's one of the riders that is feeling really motivated by that. And he feels really good going into the year for a lot of different reasons. And, things worked out well in the beginning of the race and not so well when they got caught. But that a rider like Wout van Aert would say after the race that he was one of the strongest guys on the road is a pretty cool thing to happen. It's in Dutch or something, so you can't go find this interview. I mean, you can. You can't understand it. I tried to go set it as my ringtone, but no, I think it's really validating for Mr. Squinch to feel this way after so many years in the peloton, and he loves the cobble classics. He loves these races. He had so much fun on Saturday, even if it didn't pan out exactly how he would have wanted it to, given the way that he was feeling. He's had like a blast out there racing his bike, and you could totally tell that when he was attacking Wout van Aert.
Question for you, Abby. How does it feel watching that happen on screen?
Yeah.
Watching Mr. Squinch.
Yeah, it feels a little bit surreal because, I'm not going to lie, I believe that he is capable of winning worlds. I think that he is like one of the best riders in the peloton. That he's capable of doing something like this, but to see it happen is like a bit surreal. So I felt weird on Saturday because I was like, yes, of course this is happening. But I also felt like sick to my stomach. It's like things better continue to go right because I know how much it means to him to be in that position and have the team believe in him to the point where they're like, okay, you're our guy, like do what you can. I know how much that means to him because a lot of times you go into races and he's working for Jasper, for Mess, and he loves doing that, but he also has the ability to be their guy. And I think going into like when they do put that responsibility on him, like it's very nerve-wracking because so many things need to go right.
So his form does give them more options than they would have had previously, right? Like Trek is still not going to be Visma Lisa bike going into the next couple races, but like if you end up with Toms in a front group late on, you're not worried about it, right? You're not going to chase that move down because you know that he's riding really, really well. Whereas, in previous years, if he wasn't on the form that he's on now, if you've got that front group with Wout van Aert and Toms in it, Trek is probably not that stoked on that, right? But this year, things change. I think that's really cool. Like that's good for Trek. That's good for it. It kind of shows how individual form can actually impact the way that the team itself races in a pretty dramatic way. So, and I think, like I said, we can't really be objective with this particular rider. So I don't think there's any real problem with the four of us sitting here and saying that was cool. We're going to continue on a little bit. We got a couple more things that came out of the weekend. So really the biggest, probably most important news in the entire weekend, Julian Alaphilippe shaved his face and then immediately fell down. So I think we can draw a line between those 2 points and say that the facial hair was the source of his power. No?
I almost didn't recognize him when we saw him on the ground on Saturday. Yeah, because it's become such a symbol of Alaphilippe. So I don't know why he came to that decision to Well, shave his face.
It's worked well for Danny Martinez and Primoz Roglic. So I don't know what motivated him to get rid of it, because I feel like that has clearly worked for the other, riders who so boldly have that strong facial hair look. It doesn't seem like it's a good choice.
Well, maybe he's the opposite of the trendsetter, because there are a lot of chaps sporting facial hair at the moment. Jay Vine, for instance, has got quite the moustache. So maybe rather like the mullet trend that's sweeping the peloton and the planet at the moment, Alaphilippe's not going to be growing a mullet anytime soon, and he's decided to shave his face so that he isn't just one of the other guys who's following the trends. I don't know.
That would be a look. If anybody out there is really good with Photoshop, I'd love to see a Julian Alaphilippe with a mullet. So more broadly on Alaphilippe, kind of joking about the facial hair thing, but it was a bummer to see him crash. It's been kind of a rough couple of weeks for him, right? He's been in the news for some not great reasons. The sort of spat between him and Lefebvre, and his partner Marion Roos getting involved in that and telling Lefebvre to go, stick it where the sun don't shine, and all that sort of stuff in the lead up to this. I think that, a decent ride at Omloop would have gone a long way to sort of putting Alaphilippe back in the center of the news for the reasons he'd want to be, as opposed to the reasons he doesn't want to be. There's a real danger of it just sort of slowly collapsing like a flan in a cupboard.
He's still only 31 too. I mean, I think Greg Van Avermaet was older than that when he won Roubaix. Like, he won his first and only big monument. You would think that Alaphilippe, yes, it's in 2024. We talk about how, you're over the hill once you're like 21 years old now. But I think in reality, he still should have. I mean, if Alejandro Valverde is any indication, or Oscar Sevilla, he should have plenty of years ahead of him. And it is, it's a bummer. I mean, there's really no other way to describe it, that he has not quite gotten to the level that we've seen. But hopefully there is still plenty of time.
Last storyline, I think, from the weekend, and this is an interesting one. And Abby, you brought it up, and I do want to sort of dig into this a little bit more, which is the de-sprintification of Lotte Kopecky.
Lotte Kopecky changed a lot as a rider in the last couple of years. Like, she is a track rider, and she's still super strong on the track, and we saw that already at the Europeans earlier this year. But she has become less of a sprinter and a lot stronger on the short poppy climbs. And we definitely saw her she out-climbed a bunch of really strong climbers at UAE Tour to win UAE Tour. She's changed as a rider in the last couple of years. And she said over the off season that she lost 3.5 kilograms. And I think when it comes to body composition and weight, it's a really delicate subject in the world. And so it is to be tread upon lightly. But in this particular instance, potential that she's lost fast muscle fibers in that 3.5 kilograms. Scientifically, there's something to that. And in a sprint where I think we would normally not be surprised at all to see Kopecky outsprint Voss, who is also an interesting rider because she's not really a sprinter. She's good at sprints, but she is never going to beat Wiebes or Kuhl in a sprint, probably. For Kopecky to lose a sprint to Voss, I think there are multiple factors at play, but I do think it's really interesting that she's coaching herself, and that she's been honest about losing 3.5 kilograms over the off season. And she said when she said that she didn't lose any watts, but I am wondering if that's like a 20-minute power that she's not lost watts, and it's not her, her highest 10-second, I don't know, sprinty sprint power. So I just thought it was interesting.
Yeah. The context around all this is she did a surprisingly good. I think is that an accurate representation of her riding?
Yeah, I mean, it all started on the Col de Tourmalet. Like, everyone thought she would be so far behind on that seventh stage. And then she was, I think, 6th on the stage, and she held on to 2nd overall because of that performance. And I don't think anybody saw that coming, including Kopecky.
Right. So I'm always a little wary to say surprising when you're talking about athletes at this level, because at some point they stop surprising you, right? Like, they just do crazy things all the time. But it was, in the context of her previous career, it was pretty surprising. It kind of brought to mind for me, I don't know if you guys remember, like, when Geraint Thomas was sort of making the transition from more of a kind of track and classics rider to a Grand Tour rider. And I'm now trying to remember what race it was. It was like, maybe it was Catalonia, or it was one of the smaller stage races. And all of a sudden he was climbing with, the little whippets, right? And we know that these transformations are possible, is basically what I'm saying. And it does, the context around Kopecky saying she's lost 3.5 kilos, which, is about 8 freedom units, just under 8 freedom units. It's like, that's significant, right? That's a large change in the way that she's going to be climbing, for sure. And I think that the context around the team too, because we've seen a whole bunch of sort of chatter back and forth around contracts for her and Demi Vollering and what exactly that team looks like and who it's built around going forward, and particularly who it's built around at the Tour de France. I think all of these threads tie together, and that's why something as simple as her losing a sprint to Voss at Omloop, I think, is relevant to essentially like the future of the very upper echelons of the women's marathon,
it
right?
Stands to reason that if you were going to strengthen one part of your cycling abilities, then you would have to lose something elsewhere. And I'm not saying that that's what's happened here, but I do think that that's an interesting storyline going into the rest of the season, how that will impact her ambitions on the track, because that's what she's aiming for the Olympics, the road race as well. But the track is a huge goal for her for the Olympics coming up. And also, for the rest of the year, if she's going to turn into a great climber, and they have Vollering already, who did not look great on Saturday, first race of the season. So it's really not a big deal for her, but she didn't look amazing. And I think the whole thing is super fascinating. If she has kind of shed some of her sprinter watts for those climber watts, it makes the team dynamic interesting. And obviously, since we didn't talk about it on Wheel Talk, because we did the draft this week, but she did sign a very lengthy contract with SC Works Pro Time. She's on that team until 2028, and Vollering is still up in the air. So the team has put their weight behind Kopecky, and I think that is another. They're just all these funny layers coming into play.
Let's wrap up news from the racing over the weekend and take a quick break. If you are an aero nerd, if you love optimizing your equipment, you need to be listening to Performance Process, which is Ronan McLaughlin's podcast. Let's listen to just a brief clip from a recent episode.
I'll kick us off in terms of time trialing with the old adage that lower and narrower is faster. Is that like an aero myth?
I would say.
Moving on to, I think, the most popular of aero myths. Aero doesn't matter if I'm going uphill.
Oh, classic.
The other one is, or the other classic, I guess, is aero doesn't matter if I'm slow.
Oh, this is one of my favourites. So the slower you are,
going back to time trials and positions, flat back is always fastest.
We've done literally hundreds and hundreds of athletes in the wind tunnel, and typically I would say
short tail time trial helmets are faster.
Ooh.
I have a real nice one for you now. Rim brake bikes are more aero than disc brake bikes.
Ooh, that's a good one. So,
okay, the other one, if I set up a mirror beside my turbo tuner and just replicate Dan Bigham's position, will I be as fast as him?
Oh, look, I think Dan is optimized to the hill. Dan's great.
Welcome back, everybody. We got a weird one for you. You might have seen headlines around this over the weekend. So Synisca Cycling. Abby, I'm going to let you explain, actually. What on earth happened here?
Kind of a bummer, actually, for this American team that actually, like, on Saturday won Classica Almeria with their new signing, Lawrence Evans. And then to turn around on Monday and have this news come out after they'd won a UCI race is a major bummer for such a small team. But they're in the news for some bizarre stuff, and that is that in July of last year, they showed up to a 1.1 one-day race, and they were short one rider. There's a rule about how you have to have 5 riders to start, and they only had 4 riders. So the DS at the time, Danny Van Hout, had the mechanic dress up as a 5th rider with a mask on for sign-on. So it looked like they had 5 riders, and then obviously they started only with 4. And the whole thing is super bizarre. But
we're talking a surgical mask like COVID times, right? I want to make that clarification, because when I first read that, I literally thought this person was wearing a mask that, like, Mission Impossible style. Just want to make sure we clarify that for the listeners.
The 5th rider,
just some glasses and a mustache.
The 5th rider was sick. And that's why they weren't racing, but they were at the race. But there wasn't, the fifth rider was actually not physically present at the venue when they were at the race. Ultimately, the DS in question was fired in September of last year. So this news is coming out on Monday, and I think that the UCI's statement about it is kind of misleading because it sounds like it happened recently and the DS still works for the team, but he doesn't. He was fired in September. And the mechanic was also let go for other reasons before this news broke. But yeah, the whole story is super weird. Feel I have a lot of empathy for the riders because now the team is going to be suspended from their next UCI race. And as an American team coming over here, all those resources to come over and race in Europe, to not be able to do one of those race days, it sounds like not much, but it's actually a pretty big knock on the team and the riders that are currently on the team that were maybe possibly not present for this incident last year. And when it comes to situations like this, like the DS is in charge, and like the riders, I hear a lot of times people being like, well, why didn't the riders speak up? Well, you can't. Well, I've said it before and I'll say it again. There's been no Me Too movement in women's cycling. Like, we still can't speak up. It's a lot of things are going to have to happen for a rider on this team to be able to be like, that's a dumb idea. We shouldn't do that. So I feel really bad for the riders that were involved in this, and that they also received slaps on the wrist, basically. So the riders who were at the race aren't going to be suspended or anything. Like, Danny Van Hout is not allowed to DS for a team, I think, until December of 2025, I think is what it is. And the mechanic as well is barred from participating with any teams until September 2024. So both of them got hefty sanctions, but for the riders that were involved, like, yeah, I think for them it really sucks.
This is like for American listeners out there, this is not like a random person that you've never heard of. Like, Danny Van Hout was the boss of the Jelly Belly team and then the Wildlife Generation team for like 2 decades. So he's a pretty experienced person. He's been around the block. And the fact that he ended up, thinking that this was going to work, surprising to me, but also, I don't know, unusual. A lot of different things is what it is.
I think the rule is kind of silly, right? Like, I understand why it exists. You don't want teams like signing up, taking spots, and then, running one rider. And, there have to be rules at some point. But like, was this team starting with 4 actually going to damage anything, right? And you're talking about particularly women's teams with not a whole lot of resources. Like, it's just sort of it's an artificial barrier to entry, right? Like, it's just an artificial barrier, period. These are really small programs. If you've got a couple riders that are sick, or you've got a rider who could make it, you got a rider who missed a flight, or you got something, and the whole team can't start, it feels like kind of just a rule that should have some easier exceptions made to it. Like, the commissary should have the ability on the ground to just make a decision as to whether, a team actually deserves to be punished for this and not allowed to start, because otherwise you end up in these situations, right? Where like a team is making a poor decision, Danny making a poor decision, basically because the other option was to not race at all. And that the UCI is putting them that on them. While the reaction to it was poor and the decision making was poor within the team, the rule itself to me doesn't make a whole lot of sense, or at least needs to be written so that it, again, has a bit more leeway to it. All right, well, strange story. We'll keep an eye on it. If anything else happens, we'll let you know. Of course, head over to escapecollective.com if you want to read the full piece. Let's take another quick break.
Quick break to bring you a clip from the last episode of our industry special podcast series. There's 4 of these episodes. Episode 4 is now out. It is called The Aftermath. Episodes 1, 2, and 3 really dove into what exactly went wrong during and after the pandemic and the massive rise in ridership that happened and overstock issues and all the many, many things that the industry had to deal with, sometimes well and often quite poorly, over those couple years. Episode 4 is takeaways, learnings and takeaways from the past 3 years, what the bike industry is going to try not to do again. Let's listen in.
I asked a bicycle brand leader one time this year, I said, please tell me that somewhere in the industry, there's a collective consciousness around like the dealers surviving this. And someone said to me, there's not.
I think for sure human emotion colored every decision we made. And that includes our own ambition level at wanting to grow, our own excitement to be growing after years of kind of laying the groundwork for it. A little bit of euphoria from that.
Interest rates change, and the debt in those deals is typically held by the company. And so now the company's looking around going, oh, hey guys, shit, we gotta cover, I don't know, pick a number, $250,000 a month in debt service.
Looking at things going all the way back to 2008 is like, this is not a COVID problem. Yeah, it's a big problem. Like, COVID has really spiked things, but like, they've been doing this for decades. Like, this is a problem that's been around since the dawn of time for these guys.
Welcome back, everybody. One of the race just finished. And Abby, you picked up on a funny quote from Arnaud Delis.
Yeah, he said, "Why am I in such a shit race?" And there's video of him off his bike screaming into the driver's seat of the team car. So he crashed onto the sidewalk and popped up and just started screaming at his DS.
And he was a DNF in the end.
Yeah. It's a good race. Like, I know it's a 1.1. It's not a big, massive World Tour race, but big riders have raced it and won it before. Some race has been won by Matteo Trentin, Tim Merlier, Florian Sénéchal, Nicky Terpstra. Like, big names, right?
He DNF'd this race in the end, which was won by Lawrence Rex of Intermarché Wanty. And that is actually the second time in 3 days or 4 days that Rex has beaten him, because Rex also finished just ahead of him at the Anlou Het Nieuwsblad. So maybe we should be talking about Lawrence Rex as the next up-and-comer big thing and not Arnaud Delis.
Anyway, we've got more. Our next segment here. Well, it's a question that I've got. Who's the best sprinter this year? We've gone through the UAE Tour, we've gone through TDU, we've gone through a bunch of races where we've had some decent sprints. Dane, who stands out at this point in time? Who should people be looking at as, sprinters tend to sort of come in waves of dominance, right? Who's next?
I think that who's next and who people should be looking at maybe are two slightly different questions. They are riders who used to ride on the same team, actually. As everyone is probably aware if they listen to this podcast, I think Jasper Philipsen is sort of atop the sprinting hierarchy at the moment because of his Tour de France exploits last year. He's the rider that I think everybody's going to be trying to match when it comes to Grand Tour sprints. But every year early on in the season, we usually do get these really great sprint battles at the UAE Tour. It's one of the places where Jasper Philipsen first, I think, showed that he has what it takes to beat some really big names. I guess he had some Vuelta wins before that, but the UAE Tour tends to get big names, and this year was no exception. They had a bunch of really good sprinters, and I think it's a really good opportunity to see, all right, where do the riders stand? What, form check, who comes out of the UAE Tour in good shape? Looks like that rider could be the top of the sprinting hierarchy. Philipsen wasn't there, so I think we have to keep Philipsen in mind. He's probably the de facto current top of the hierarchy right now, but his former teammate, Tim Merlier, sure looks good at the UAE Tour. And Tim Merlier is somebody who has already won a Tour de France stage. He's somebody who, for a little while, seemed like he was about to go win a bunch of Grand Tour stages, and then over the last 2 years kind of quieted down a little bit. And this year might not go to a Grand Tour. We're not really sure what's going to happen with Tim Merlier this year. But coming out of
he finds himself on a GC team now, so he's...
the poor guy went to this team hoping that he was going to get all these chances because it's a team that tends to be great for sprinters. I could think of a certain Mark Cavendish who went there and had a little bit of a career resurgence. And unfortunately for him, Remco Evenepoel is getting all the attention now. So poor Tim Merlier over at Soudal Quickstep is going to have to find his own opportunities. But he did win 2 stages at the UAE Tour. He won 2 stages at the Al Ula Tour. So I think right now you're looking at Philipsen and Tim Merlier. Both of them used to ride for Alpecin Phoenix.
For me, it wasn't winning sprints at UAE Tour, great, but it was more the manner in which he was doing it. He was just so much faster than everybody else in the sort of top 5. He would come from 5th or 6th wheel and just blast past everybody. It was really impressive sprinting, and it was the kind of sprinting that he was so dominant that it didn't look like he even needed to really time it that well, which is maybe says a lot about his ability to do it again later in the season. I think that for me was what stood out.
Yeah, it would be nice to see him go up against Philipsen. I just don't know how many opportunities they're going to have given the GC focus at his own team now.
Well, he's probably in a position where he kind of needs to prove himself, which if he is the best sprinter in the world, and he probably is in the top 3 regardless of what time we are in the season. But whereas Fabio Jakobsen, who is also at the UAE Tour, but is, he's getting used to his new team. It's early in the season. He is their marquee sprinter, a de facto team leader. Merlier is in a position where he, maybe he'll get a seat at the Giro, but he's probably unlikely to go to the Tour if Evenepoel doesn't get injured before then, because the team's going to be built around their young GC hopeful. And then you look at Philipsen, who again, he is the reigning green jersey holder, probably the best sprinter, in that top spot. But he's having a steadier start to the season, shall we say. He said at the weekend that he's off the boil. He's not quite where he'd like to be yet. He's not where he wants to be, where he needs to be if he's going to compete for these sprints. But he maybe, whereas Merlier needs to prove himself, which seems mad, really. These others don't necessarily need to. So it's just that funny time in the season.
Another rider who did prove himself, and the one who maybe came out of the UAE Tour also feeling the best besides Merlier is Olaf Koy, who's just 22 years old. He's somebody that we've been kind of keeping an eye on for a little bit because Visma, Lisa Bike, go figure, signed him as a young up-and-comer, knowing that he had a lot of potential. And yeah, he won a stage. He won the Classica de Almeria in like 2.5 weeks ago. And I think another situation where we don't know how many opportunities he's going to get in the biggest races, but I think he's slated to go to the Giro. And
with his lead-out man, Wout van Aert.
I have to imagine that team is going to be pretty strong at the Giro.
Team is pretty strong everywhere they go.
Yeah, that is true.
At least they're not boring about it, though. Right? Like when Sky was strong, they were boring about it, and we hated it. But like they win interesting, right? I mean, think about Omloop over the weekend. Like they chucked so many different guys up the road, and that's cool. That's interesting. That's a cool way to win a bike race. Like they didn't just sit on the front and then, this doesn't really work in the classics, which is why Sky never won any. They just sit on the front and then like send Wout van Aert up the Wolvenberg or something like that, right? Like that would be annoying. I'm okay with for now. I'm okay with Visma dominance because they do it in interesting ways.
They also win at least the most recent Grand Tour in very interesting ways. They made that one really fun to watch. So
yeah, accidentally, I think.
Yeah, I don't think that was intentional, and I feel bad for all involved with the awkwardness they had to go through. But it was fun. It was dramatic.
Yeah.
One last sprinter note though.
I think they came through it okay.
Mark Cavendish didn't look great at the UAE Tour, and just has not quite reached the level where I'm thinking he's going to feel super confident yet. But obviously, it is February, and so plenty of time for him to do that. He has already taken his first race win of the year down in Colombia. Would expect that
he did go home sick too.
Yeah, he did not. He didn't start the 6th stage. He left midway through the race, not feeling well. I guess it's possible that he wasn't feeling well from the very beginning because he didn't really contest he wasn't up there really any of the earlier sprints even before he left the race.
And Mark Cavendish is the kind of sprinter who's either there or he's not there. He's either in the top 3 or he's 29th.
Can I make an excuse for him?
I already have. Go for it.
Weird. It's weird to find myself defending Mark Cavendish. I would have spent the first 10 plus years of my career doing the exact opposite, but I had suddenly become Cavendish stan here in the last 18 months. Here's my excuse. As a fellow old person, me and Mark Cavendish are of similar oldness. It takes a lot longer to get in shape when you're old. Like I coach like mountain bike kids around here, high school kids, and they go from 0 to 60 in like 2 weeks. And it takes me 3 months to get fit. So maybe that's what's wrong. Maybe he's just an old man and it's going to take a while to get up to speed, and he's going to be raring to go in July. He's going to win this 30-minute tour stage. That's not sprinter talk. We're in classics mode. Speaking of which, we got Strade Bianche this weekend. So we're going to do the world's shortest preview. My guy on my draft team, Tadej Pogačar, is starting his season, which means that I will scrape myself off of dead last in the Escape Collective draft competition. Who else are we keeping an eye on for Strade this weekend?
I do think, that's a little bold, a little confident of you, Caley, just to say you're going to scrape yourself out of last with just one guy. We are going to see a few other riders, in this race. And yes, Tadej Pogačar is a rider who has won before, but the defending champion, Tom Pidcock, will be there. And he is somebody who, although I kind of badmouthed him in how the race was won this week and said that I was disappointed in his Omloop performance, I do think he'll be pretty good. We should mention, the course is not changing too much, but just in case you've lived under a rock and don't know what Strade Bianche is, whenever we preview a race, we do point out what the course is. It's a race where you go over gravel roads a bunch of times and then you finish on a steep hill into Siena. So yeah, if you don't know what Strade Bianche is, which seems unlikely because you're listening to a bike racing podcast, that's what's coming up. And yeah, we're going to see Tadej Pogačar, Tom Pidcock. We'll have an artist not racing, so we're going to see some alternative options from the Visma Lisa bike team. Is anybody going to be surprised if they win anyway? No. Keep an eye out on Saturday. It's an RCS race, so RCS one days like Milan San Remo happen on Saturday. That's something that's always worth pointing out. I feel like every year people say, oh no, it's on Saturday, because they're used to them being on Sunday. But in Italy, they like to do things on Saturday. So
the women's race,
what about the women's race?
137 kilometers with 38.9 kilometers of gravel roads, I think. I'm not sure if that's correct, but it's around the right numbers. And I think we thought we'd be looking at an SD Works, like just demolishing on Saturday, and that didn't happen, but I do think that is what we are up against for Strade Bianche. They went 1-2 last year with the look between two riders that fueled an entire year's worth of speculation. Demi Vollering and Lotte Kopecky, are they friends? Do they hate each other? And I think those are the two riders that everyone's going to be looking at again, although I think that Little Trek is going to feel pretty good after their performance on Saturday. And they have Elise Lange-Borghini, who's won Strade twice, I think, in her career, and is looking like she's coming into form. Plus Shirin Van Anrooy, who had a great ride there last year. So yeah, I think it's going to be a really great race. There's a lot of riders on the start list that can throw a wrench in SD Works plans. Kristen Faulkner just won Almu Van Het Hageland with a 50K solo move on Sunday. So she's done well there in the past as well. So I think it's going to be a great race. Live coverage for the women's race is early AF. We reminded everyone to watch on Saturday. I'm reminding you to watch very early in the morning for the women's race. This is one of the earliest races of the year. They start at like 9 in the morning or 9:30 in the morning, which in Europe. So the live coverage is 11 Central European Time, CET. Is that what that stands for? To 2 o'clock, which is about 6 a.m., I think, for you, Caley.
It's at least like kind of watchable for the Aussie listeners out there. It's like you might actually be able to finish it before you go to bed, which is untrue of a lot of other races.
Yes. It's a great race. We love Strade. We will obviously bring you news from the race next week. We have a lot of podcasts, so I'm just going to run through real quick for our listeners out there where they can get what they want, right? So the things that will happen next week, and this is basically true of sort of every week through the season. We'll do it in chronological order. We have How the Race Was Won, which drops on sort of US Euro Mondays. And obviously that is How the Race Was Won. That's mostly focused on the men's race. That's with Dane and Cosmo. Does what it says on the tin. So it's a tactical breakdown, an analysis of the teams, an analysis of the riders. It's a really very nerdy, quite serious look at the weekend's bike racing. Next up is Abby and the crew with Wheel Talk, which does a similar thing over on the women's racing side. A little bit broader scope, I would say, to Wheel Talk. Actually, a lot broader scope to Wheel Talk than How the Race Was Won. But touch on many of the same themes, particularly after a major race like that. Then, of course, we've got Placeholders in the middle of the week. That shows up on usually US Wednesday is what we shoot for. Bit broader show. We talk about the racing. We maybe look at some of the broader trends. We maybe look at some of the other news items that are floating around in the cycling world. Basically, Placeholders just talks about whatever we think is most interesting in a particular week of all of cycling. Followed by, on Thursday, Geek Warning, which if you are an equipment nerd, tech nerd, that's the one that you want to be listening to. Now, all of these podcasts are all on the Escape Collective's main, we call it the everything feed internally. If you follow or subscribe to the Escape Collective podcast feed, you're going to get every single one of these podcasts, plus basically bits of some of the special episodes that we do for members. So you'll get like half of Performance Process episodes, which you heard earlier in the show is a pretty nerdy take on equipment and optimization from Ronan. That's the network. So, I just wanted to make sure everybody kind of understands where you can get what you're looking for. We hope you enjoy all the shows. Of course, if you are a member, well, it's in your email. Get on the member feed, because there's extra stuff that shows up in the member feed. There's extra episodes. There's full Performance Process episodes. You get Escape After Dark at the end of this show. You get all kinds of good stuff. You get special Geek Warning episodes, sort of Ask Mechanic stuff, and Q&A episodes. There's all sorts of members-only content on that members feed. If you're a member and you Google Escape Collective member-only podcast, it'll take you to a page that only you can open if you're logged in, and you can get the member feed there. All right, that was enough housekeeping, I think, right? We're going to head into Escape After Dark. If you're a member, you can keep listening. We're going to be talking about whether Strade Bianche should be a monument. We're going to talk a little bit more about monuments in general and whether this is just a construct, actually a relatively recent construct, and whether we should just be the monument deciding committee. I think we probably should be. If you are a member, stick around. If you're not a member, thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.